EVO. There are moments in history when the world changes loudly, with armies, proclamations, and the slow grind of empires shifting their weight. And then there are moments when history changes quietly. A festival day, a wedding, a king walking unarmored through a crowd that loved him. Philip II of Macedon had spent 2 decades doing what no Greek ruler had ever accomplished. He had taken a rough northern kingdom, dismissed by the cultured cities of the south as half barbaric, and turned it into the most powerful military force the Greek world had ever seen. The cities of Greece were finally under his control. A unified army stood ready. And beyond the Aegean lay his next prize, Persia, the greatest empire on earth. The plan was already in motion. The invasion was soon to begin. The conquest of the East would belong to Philip. But first, there was a celebration. In the ancient capital of Ides, Philip staged a grand wedding for his daughter, a display of power, unity, and confidence. Delegations came from across Greece, nobles, generals, ambassadors. The theater overflowed. Music, banners, ceremony. And then Philip did something that felt like a statement. He dismissed his bodyguards. The message was clear. He was loved. He was secure. He had nothing to fear from his own people. As he entered the theater, walking alone between rows of cheering spectators, a man stepped forward. His name was Pausanias. He was not an enemy soldier. He was not a foreign assassin. He was one of Philip's own bodyguards. The blade struck fast, deep, direct to the chest from the side. Philip collapsed in front of the crowd. The most powerful man in Greece, dying on the stone floor of his own celebration. Pausanias ran, but he didn't get far. Other guards cut him down before he could even speak, which meant that whatever he knew died with him. And the questions began immediately. Was this revenge for a personal grievance? Was it a political conspiracy? Had powerful figures inside the court decided Philip had lived long enough? We don't know. But what we do know is this. In the chaos that followed, before the body was even cold, a 20-year-old prince moved quickly. Because in Macedon, power didn't wait. And neither did the people who wanted it. Within 10 years, that young prince would conquer the known world. He would defeat the Persian Empire. He would march to Egypt. He would cross into India. His soldiers would begin to call him a god. And by the age of 32, he'll be dead, under circumstances that historians still debate. Because the story of Alexander the Great isn't just a story of the greatest conqueror in history. It's the story of what happens when a man moves faster than the world around him, and when power grows so large that someone may decide it has to be stopped. Welcome back to the Ides of April. This is a series about the moments when history turns, not slowly or gently, but suddenly, when a single death, a single decision, or a single act of violence changes the course of the human story. In this 3-part series, we're stepping into the brief, brilliant, and extremely violent life of Alexander of Macedon, the man history remembers as Alexander the Great. But before he was a conqueror, he was a son, standing in the shadow of a murdered king. There was a poet in the Greek world, long before Alexander was born, who understood something about glory. His name was Pindar. He wrote for athletes and kings, for victors at the peak of their triumph. And he warned them of something that no victory could escape. Creatures of a day. What is a man? For Pindar, greatness was never permanent. Glory was like light, and light fades. Chapter 1. The Inheritance of Violence. The kingdom Alexander inherited was not merely a territory bounded by mountains and rivers. It was a living engine, forged in iron discipline and sharpened by a generation of almost continuous war. To understand the young king who would soon stride eastward into legend, we first have to understand the world that shaped him, a rugged land where survival depended on strength, loyalty, and the swift elimination of weakness. You see, Macedon was not Athens or Thebes or any of the polished city-states of southern Greece that prided themselves on philosophy, drama, and debate. This was a harsher country. Its northern plains cut by cold winds that swept down from the Balkans, its highlands thick with forests where wolves still hunted, and winter lingered long after spring had softened the southern coasts. The men of Macedon grew up in a world where the soil was stubborn, the seasons were unforgiving, and the expectation of violence was as ordinary as the turning of the year. Philip II had understood this landscape better than any ruler before him. From it, he had built his army, farmers hardened by weather and scarcity, trained into a professional force whose discipline marched the iron length of their sarissas, the great pikes that turned infantry into a moving wall of wood and steel. Under Philip, this army had defeated every rival in Greece. Under Philip, Macedon had become not merely a kingdom, but a power whose reach extended from the mountains of Epirus to the shores of the Aegean. But Philip had also ruled through a system as unstable as it was effective. Macedon kingship was not the distant ceremonial authority of a god king. It was personal. The king ate with his companions, he hunted with them, he drank with them, he fought beside them. Their loyalty was earned daily, and it could be lost just as quickly. Around him gathered a court of powerful nobles, ambitious generals, and relatives whose closeness to the throne was both a privilege and a constant temptation. Alexander had grown up inside this atmosphere of tension. As a boy, he had watched alliances shift, rivalries harden, and political disputes settle not with compromise, but with exile, imprisonment, or death. His mother, Olympias, fierce and deeply devoted to her son's destiny, had taught him that power was not given, but taken and defended with relentless vigilance. His father, brilliant and unpredictable, had shown him how quickly affection and favor could change within a royal household. When Philip was murdered at Ides, the danger facing Alexander was immediate and absolute. He was 20 years old. His claim to the throne, though strong, wasn't unchallenged. Philip had married more than once, and each marriage had produced connections to powerful families whose ambitions didn't end with the king's death. In the volatile hours following the assassination, the question wasn't who should rule, but who would act quickly enough to ensure that they did. Alexander acted with a decisiveness that revealed how closely he had studied the brutal mathematics of Macedonian power. The army proclaimed him king, and that endorsement carried the weight of necessity. Yet the army alone couldn't secure the throne. Rivals existed within the royal family itself, and those rivals had supporters. One by one, potential threats were removed. Some were executed, others disappeared from public life. The young queen Cleopatra, not that Cleopatra, and her infant child, symbols of an alternative line of succession, didn't survive the struggle. Olympias, moving with a cold determination that matched her son's urgency, oversaw acts of vengeance that ensured no competing claim would gather strength. It was a ruthless beginning, but in Macedon, ruthlessness was not cruelty. It was insurance. Even as the court was being purged, danger gathered beyond the kingdom's borders. The cities of Greece, long resentful of Macedonian dominance, saw in Philip's death an opportunity. Athens debated rebellion. Thebes, proud and historically defiant, began to believe that the alliance Philip had forced upon them might dissolve under the rule of an inexperienced kid. Rumors spread that Macedon was divided, that the new king would struggle to hold the army together, that the moment for resistance had come. Alexander understood that hesitation would be fatal. In early spring, as the snows retreated and the Macedonian highlands and the rivers swelled with meltwater, he marched south. The speed of his advance stunned the Greek world. Cities that had been preparing for negotiation suddenly found his army at their gates. Athens reconsidered its position. Others hurried to reaffirm their loyalty. Only Thebes chose defiance. Now, Thebes had once been the dominant military power in Greece. Its sacred band had defeated Sparta, its traditions were ancient, its pride unbroken. When Alexander demanded submission, the city refused. Macedonian authority, they believed, depended on fear of Philip. Without Philip, that fear would fade. They misjudged the sun. The siege was swift and merciless. Macedonian troops breached the walls and flooded into the streets. Fighting raged from house to house. When it ended, the city that had challenged Macedon lay in ruins. Thousands were killed, thousands more sold into slavery. Thebes ceased to exist as a political force. Only temples and a few sacred sites were spared, along with the house of the poet Pindar, a gesture that acknowledged the enduring power of words even as the physical city was erased. News of Thebes' destruction traveled quickly across Greece, carried along trade routes and whispered in marketplaces and assembly halls. The message was unmistakable. Philip had unified Greece through strategy and negotiation. Alexander would hold it through force, and he would not hesitate to use it. For the young king, the campaign achieved more than security. It cleared his rear. With Greece subdued and no rival strong enough to challenge him at home, Alexander was free to consider the ambition that had defined his father's final years. Across the Aegean lay the Persian Empire, vast beyond any kingdom the Greeks had ever controlled or even dreamed of. Its wealth was legendary, its territory stretching from the Mediterranean to the distant lands of Central Asia. Philip had intended to invade. Preparations were already underway when he died. Now that plan belonged to Alexander. The winds of early summer moved across the Macedonian plains, bending the grain and carrying the scent of distant rain. Armies assembled, ships were gathered, supplies were counted and loaded. Men who had spent their lives defending their homeland prepared to march beyond it, into lands most of them only knew from stories. At their head stood a king who had secured his throne not through inheritance, but through speed, violence, and the unshakable certainty that hesitation meant extinction. The world beyond Macedon was about to learn what Greece already understood. Philip had built a machine. Alexander was about to unleash it. Chapter 2: The War That Made a Myth. When Alexander crossed into Asia, he didn't march as a conqueror alone. He crossed as a young man stepping into a story he already believed had been written for him. The crossing itself was deliberate, almost ceremonial. In the spring of 334 BC, the Macedonian army moved down through the Hellespont, the narrow strait where Europe gives way to Asia, where the waters carry not only trade and ships, but memory. This was the passage the Persian kings had once crossed in the opposite direction, when their armies threatened Greece generations earlier. Now the direction was reversed. Alexander paused before setting foot on Asian soil. According to later accounts, he cast a spear into the ground and declared the continent won by the spear. It was theater, but it was also something deeper. He understood that conquest, like kingship, depended not only on force, but on narrative. His men were not simply invading. They were fulfilling a destiny. Before advancing inland, he made a pilgrimage. At the ruins of Troy, where the plains stretch wide and wind-blown toward the Aegean, Alexander visited the tomb of Achilles. He ran naked around it in ritual tribute and exchanged his armor for sacred weapons said to have belonged to the Homeric heroes. Achilles was more than a figure from legend to him. He was a model, a warrior who chose glory over a long life, whose name would endure even as his body fell. The choice wasn't subtle. Alexander did not intend to live quietly. From Troy, the army marched eastward into Persian territory, and the first test came quickly, along the banks of the Granicus River. Persian forces had gathered to block the advance, confident that their cavalry and numbers would overwhelm the Macedonian force before it could establish itself in Asia. The river ran fast with spring runoff, its banks steep and uneven, the water cold from the mountain snows. Any general trained in caution would have waited, searched for a better crossing, maybe avoided attacking directly into the current while the army held the far shore. But Alexander? Nope. He attacked immediately. The assault was chaotic and dangerous. Horses struggled against the current. Formations broke apart. The Persian cavalry pressed down from above. At one point, Alexander himself, visible in his distinctive white-plumed helmet, found himself surrounded. A Persian nobleman raised a curved blade and struck, splitting the helmet and glancing off his skull. Another attacker moved in from behind. Alexander would have died there, not in glory, not in legend, but in a muddy river at the beginning of a campaign, if not for one of his companions, Cletus the Black, who cut the attacker down before the blow fell. And then the battle turned. The Persian line broke. Their infantry collapsed under the advance of the Macedonian phalanx, the long sarissas driving forward like a moving forest of spear points. Victory at Granicus did more than secure a foothold. It sent a freaking message. Alexander would not fight carefully, he would not preserve himself, and he would place himself at the point of danger again and again. This wasn't recklessness, at least not entirely. This was leadership, performed in the oldest and most powerful language that soldiers understood. A king who risked his life beside them became something more than a commander. He became a symbol. As the army moved south along the coast of Asia Minor, city after city opened its gates. Some surrendered willingly, others required brief sieges. But in each case, Alexander presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, freeing Greek cities from Persian rule, restoring autonomy, honoring local traditions. It was a carefully thought out political strategy, but it also served a larger purpose. With each success, the story grew. The young king who had destroyed Thebes, the warrior who charged rivers and survived blades, the leader who never hesitated. By the time the Persian king Darius III finally assembled a full imperial army to confront him, Alexander's reputation had already begun to travel much faster than his march. The confrontation finally came at Issus. The battlefield lay between mountains and sea, a narrow strip of land that compressed the massive Persian army and negated its advantage in numbers. Darius, seated in a chariot behind ranks of infantry and cavalry, commanded what should have been an overwhelming force. The air that day was thick with dust and tension. The mountains rose steep and shadowed on one side, the Mediterranean dark and restless on the other. Between them stood two armies representing two different visions of power, one ancient and imperial, the other young, aggressive, and driven by momentum. Alexander, again, chose the point of greatest danger. Instead of engaging across the line, he led a wedge of cavalry directly toward Darius himself. The attack split the Persian formation, cutting through guards and chariots, closing the distance between king and king. When Darius saw the Macedonian cavalry approaching, he did something no Persian king was ever expected to do. He ran. The retreat spread panic through the Persian ranks. What began as withdrawal became complete collapse. Soldiers just threw down their shields and ran. The imperial camp, with its wealth and royal family, fell into Macedonian hands. It was a decisive victory, but its significance went beyond the battlefield. For the first time, the king of Persia had turned his back on a Greek army. And the man who forced him to do it was 23 years old. In the weeks that followed, Alexander treated the captured Persian royal family with unexpected respect. Darius's mother, wife, and children were not harmed or humiliated. They were given protection, dignity, and assurances that their status would be preserved. Again, This was a calculated political act. Alexander was no longer fighting simply to defeat Persia. He was positioning himself to inherit it. The victories at Granicus and Issus changed the nature of the campaign. What had begun as a bold invasion now took on the momentum of inevitability. Cities opened their gates without resistance. Local rulers shifted allegiance. Even those who feared him began to believe that resistance might be pointless. And within the Macedonian camp, something else began to change. Alexander's confidence, always strong, had grown into certainty. He had survived the river. He had survived the blade. He had driven the king of Persia from the field. The pattern was becoming clear. Risk, danger, victory. To his soldiers, he appeared favored by fortune. To Alexander himself, the pattern may have suggested something more. Pindar had once written that glory comes to those who seize it boldly. But he had also warned that even the brightest flame burns only briefly. Yet in these early years of the campaign, there was little to suggest limits. Each battle reinforced the same lesson. The world did not resist him. It yielded. And as the army pushed deeper into the territories of the Persian Empire, the story surrounding their king began to shift. He was no longer simply a brilliant general or a daring young ruler. He was becoming a figure of legend while he was still alive. The war was no longer only about defeating an enemy. It was becoming a performance of destiny. And Alexander was beginning to believe the role was real.
There are moments in life when talking to someone, a professional, an objective voice could make all the difference. But for a lot of people, the biggest obstacle isn't deciding to try therapy. It's finding a therapist who actually takes your insurance. That's where Rula comes in. Rula is an online mental health platform that works with over 100 insurance plans, making the average copay about $15 per session. In some cases, it can be even less. It's licensed therapy covered by insurance the way mental health care should be. Rula also takes the guesswork out of finding the right provider. Instead of assigning you the first available therapist, they match you with in-network licensed professionals based on your goals, preferences, and background, because fit matters. There are no long wait lists, and appointments can be available as soon as tomorrow. Thousands of people are already using Rula to get affordable, high-quality therapy that's actually covered by insurance. Visit Rula.com/Ides to get started. After you sign up, you'll be asked how you heard about them. Please support our show and let them know we sent you. That's Rula.com/Ides. You deserve mental health care that works with you, not against your budget. Our dogs are family, and they deserve food that treats them that way. That's why Ollie makes meals with fresh, human-grade ingredients you can actually recognize. Chicken, beef, carrots, blueberries, spinach, no fillers, no byproducts, just real nutrition slow-cooked to keep your pup healthy and energized. Shinier coats, better digestion, more energy, and with 5 protein-packed flavors like beef with sweet potatoes or turkey with blueberries, your dog may be eating better than you. Every plan is customized to your dog's age, breed, and activity level, and delivered right to your door in perfectly portioned, easy-to-serve packs. Simple, fresh, and made just for them. Now here's how you can try it. Your dog's well-being starts with their food, and that's why Ollie delivers fresh, human-grade food that your dog will love. Head to ollie.com/Ides. Tell them all about your dog and use code IDES to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/Ides and enter code IDES to get 60% off your first box. Most people can't name every financial account they have or what any of them are really worth. A 401k here, an old brokerage there, a few credit cards, maybe a forgotten savings account. It's a kind of financial fog, and it's costing people money. Monarch cuts through that fog. It's an all-in-one personal finance platform that brings your entire financial life together, cleanly, clearly, and instantly on your laptop or your phone. Link your accounts in minutes. See where your money's actually going and take control of it. Monarch does the heavy lifting. Smart categorization, powerful visuals, and planning tools trusted by professionals. It's been named Best Budgeting App of 2025 by the Wall Street Journal, Forbes Best App for Couples, and listed among CNBC's top fintech companies in the world. Don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code IDES at monarch.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code IDES.
Chapter 3. The Fall of an Empire. After Issus, the war changed shape. Darius had fled the field, leaving behind his chariot, his treasure, his family, and the illusion of invincibility that had surrounded Persian kings for generations. But the Persian Empire didn't collapse with its monarch's retreat. It was too large for that, too deeply rooted in the landscapes and the peoples that had sustained it for 2 centuries. Its power flowed through its great capitals, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, through its governors and administrators, through roads that stretched across deserts and mountains, binding together lands that spoke different languages and worshiped different gods. So to defeat Persia, Alexander would have to do more than win battles. He would have to take its heart. The march eastward continued slowly, deliberately, following the coastline south through Phoenicia, where Persian naval power still posed something of a threat. Most cities surrendered when the Macedonian army appeared, but one didn't. Tyre. The island city rose from the Mediterranean like a fortress of stone, its walls plunging directly into deep water, its harbors protected, its people confident that distance and the sea would keep them safe. When Alexander demanded entry to perform a ritual sacrifice to their god Melkart, the Tyrians refused. It was a small act of defiance, but Alexander no longer tolerated defiance. The siege that followed lasted 7 months. Engineers drove a causeway through the sea, stone by stone, while Tyrian ships attacked from both sides. Towers burned, workers died under arrows and stones, storms tore at the growing land bridge. Again and again, the work was destroyed and rebuilt. It was a struggle of endurance, of will, against water and time. When the walls finally fell, the punishment was severe. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were sold into slavery. The city that had trusted the sea to protect it learned the lesson that Alexander was now teaching the entire world. No distance, no walls, no single element of nature would stop him. From Tyre, the army moved south into Egypt, where resistance vanished almost entirely. The Persians were gone, their authority already weakened by Alexander's victories. Egyptian priests welcomed the young king as a liberator, a restorer of order after foreign rule. And there, on the edge of the Nile Delta, where desert met the Mediterranean and wind carried the scent of salt and sand, Alexander founded a city that would bear his name. Alexandria. It was more than a settlement. It was a statement. A mark placed deliberately on the map. A promise that this campaign was not simply destruction, but transformation. Wherever he went, Alexander did not merely conquer. He left behind structures, cities, roads, the institutions, all meant to carry his presence forward after the army moved on. But the most important journey in Egypt wasn't to the coast. It was into the desert. Across barren plains where the air shimmered and the horizon blurred, Alexander traveled to the oasis of Siwa, home to the ancient oracle of Zeus Ammon. What was said inside the temple remains uncertain. The sources conflict, the details lost to time and retelling, but afterward, something changed. Whether the priests declared him the son of Zeus or whether he just chose to believe it himself, the effect was the same. Alexander began to see his victories not simply as the result of skill or courage. He saw them as confirmation. He was favored. He was chosen. He was set apart from ordinary men. When he left Egypt and turned northeast toward the interior of the Persian Empire, he no longer marched only as a king. He marched as a man whose destiny now carried divine approval. The final confrontation came in the autumn of 331 BCE on a wide plain near a small village called Gaugamela. This time Darius was ready. The Persian king had chosen the battlefield carefully, a vast, level expanse ideal for cavalry and chariots, where his enormous army could deploy its full strength. The ground had even been cleared and flattened in advance to ensure the effectiveness of chariots designed to cut through infantry formations. And the numbers were staggering. Ancient sources may exaggerate, but even conservative estimates suggest that Darius outnumbered Alexander several times over. The night before the battle, the Persian camp stretched across the horizon, fires burning in long lines that flickered against the dark. Macedonian soldiers looked out across that sea of light and understood the scale of what waited for them. Alexander slept peacefully. At dawn, the two armies moved toward each other across the open plain. The Persian line extended far beyond the Macedonian flanks, a deliberate attempt to surround and crush the smaller force. Darius stood in his chariot at the center, visible above the ranks, the symbol of imperial power. Alexander responded with the tactic that had already become his signature. He aimed for the king. Leading his companion cavalry in a tight wedge formation, he drove diagonally across the battlefield, creating space, stretching the Persian line, drawing their forces away from the center. Then, when the gap opened, he struck. The charge cut through the infantry and guards straight toward Darius. It had happened again. Faced with the sudden approach of Alexander's cavalry and the collapse of his central line, the Persian king turned his chariot and split. Once more, the sight of the great king retreating broke the will of his army. Resistance dissolved. The enormous Persian force disintegrated into chaos and retreat across the plain. This time there would be no recovery. After Gaugamela, the road to the imperial capitals lay wide open. Babylon surrendered without resistance. Susa followed. And finally, in the ceremonial heart of the empire, at Persepolis, Alexander walked through the halls of a dynasty that had ruled the East for generations. Persia was finished. What had begun as an invasion was now something else entirely. Alexander was no longer a challenger. He was the absolute ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen. With the fall of Persia, there was no rival power left to oppose him, no enemy strong enough to check his ambition, no frontier that marked the limits of his authority. For the first time since his father's death, there was nothing left in the world to stop Alexander. And when power no longer meets resistance, it begins to change the man who holds it. Alexander had inherited a kingdom through blood. He had secured Greece through fear. He had destroyed the greatest empire the world had ever known. And he had done it all before he turned 26. From the plains of Macedon to the palaces of Persia, the pattern had been the same. Risk, speed, victory. Every gamble had been rewarded. Every danger had strengthened the story forming around him. The soldiers who followed him believed they were marching with the greatest commander of their age or of any age. Alexander himself was beginning to believe something even more dangerous, that he couldn't fail. Pindar warned that fortune lifts men only briefly, and that even the brightest flame burns within the limits of time. But in these early years, there were no limits, no rival power, no serious resistance, no force strong enough to slow the momentum he had created. For the first time in history, one man stood at the center of a world that seemed ready to yield to his will. And when the world yields too easily, it begins to change the man who holds it. Because in our next episode, victory will begin to reshape Alexander, his court, his army, and his sense of who he really is. He will adopt the customs of kings who were treated like gods. He will demand loyalty that feels more like worship. And before long, the distance between Alexander and the men who once called him companion will grow so wide that one of them will die by his hand. That's next week on the Ides of April. The Ides of April is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For the Ides of April, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.